Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Building Something Better, Finding Community-Led Solutions to Damaging Urban Transportation Infrastructure. I am Audrey Wenning, Senior Director at the Metropolitan Planning Council. MPC is an independent, nonprofit planning and policy organization that works to build equity in the built environment in the greater Chicago region. We are so thrilled to have all of you joining us here today for this important conversation. To make sure we can all engage easily, I want to go over a few housekeeping points briefly. We have enabled the chat and Q&A functions here on Zoom. You can find them both in the bottom portion of your screen. We ask that you use the chat box throughout the session to share your thoughts with us or to get our attention about something. We'll be taking questions from the audience later. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A to post them. This event also features live closed captioning. So please click closed captions here in Zoom to turn the captions on and off. Here's what you can expect today. First, I am going to give a brief presentation about MPC's new report, Connecting Communities, Mitigating Harms of Transportation Infrastructure. And then we'll have a discussion with our expert panel, who I will introduce now. Lauren Burdett is the first deputy at the City of Chicago's Office of Equity and Racial Justice. This team seeks to achieve equity in the city's services delivery, decision-making, and community engagement processes. She is charged with engaging all city departments in normalizing racial equity, creating departmental cohorts, and leading opportunities for racial equity work, as well as embedding racial equity in mayoral policies and initiatives. Some of her accomplishments in the role thus far include creation of the Chicago Connected program, a free internet program for low-income Chicago public school students, and designing and leading Chicago's first ever budget equity process for city departments. Lauren received her Master of Public Policy from the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy and earned her Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. So thanks for being with us today, Lauren Burdett. We also have Lauren Meyer here with us, who is the Communications Manager at the Congress for the New Urbanism, where she contributes to the strategic direction of CNU's communications and outreach, executes general communication, and supports programmatic work. Her scope includes CNU's Highways to Boulevards program, which offers a path forward for communities impacted by burdensome urban highways to repair, rebuild, and reknit. Prior to joining CNU, Lauren was a fellow with the US EPA doing communications in the Office of Water. Lauren holds a BA in Environmental Studies and Media and Cultural Studies from Macalester College in St. Paul. Javon Moore is the Planning and Investment Manager at Austin Coming Together. He is responsible for leading the planning and investments team. He helps evaluate initiatives that contribute to and drive planning and investments to improve the physical landscape of Austin for its residents. Javon is a graduate of Morehouse College with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Religion and of McCormick Theologic Seminary with their Master of Arts in Ministry. Javon also serves as the lead pastor of Bryn Mawr Community Church. Now I'll provide an overview of MPC's new report. We're dropping a link into the chat for you. And as we saw that the bipartisan infrastructure law was on its way to being passed in 2021, and that there would be a new Reconnecting Communities grant program, our organization thought it would be a good opportunity to work directly with communities to generate ideas for future grant applications in our region and get ourselves organized before the notice of funding opportunity came out. This report documents the process we went through in documenting harms of transportation infrastructure, collecting project ideas, and evaluating ideas for future grant applications. Like many other large regions in the US, The Chicago region built many expressways through existing communities in the 1960s and 1970s. In fact, the construction of the US Interstates 55, 57, 90, 94, and 290 in Chicago resulted in the displacement of more than 6,000 families in our city. Black and immigrant communities were the frequent targets of these massive federally funded public works projects. As shown here in the right image, the 14-lane Dan Ryan Expressway bisected previously intact communities on the south side. The CTA line, which is now the red line, was built in the median of the highway, and that opened in 1969. In this slide, we see the intact Chinatown neighborhood before the construction of the interstate highway system and after construction on the right side, where interchanges between the Stevenson and Dan Ryan expressways consumed huge amounts of land and created massive barriers between neighborhoods. There also is a lot of existing freight rail in that neighborhood. Chinatown not only lost residential development and small businesses during the highway construction era, but green space as well. Hardin Square Park was a community center with a field house serving Chinese residents that was demolished to facilitate highway construction. The community advocated for the return of park space through the development of Sun Yat-sen Park and later Ping Tom Memorial Park. We've grown up with these highways and normalized their existence, but they have created and still create huge impacts. First of all, noise. This is a very underappreciated impact. Waiting transit riders in the highway medians, such as those on the red line and the blue line, must tolerate deafening noise from the passing traffic. Sound levels regularly exceed 70 decibels, which is a level deemed harmful to human hearing. This is a map with data from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. And people living adjacent to the highways hear this noise day and night. When we think about air quality, this map shows the prevalence of asthma in Chicago, and you can see in red lines where the highways are located. Significant areas in Chicago have small particulate matter, known as PM2.5, in the 80th to 100th percentile of national values. Most of these locations are near major highways, and we know that asthma is worsened by air pollution. In terms of household income, we know that healthy communities were severely damaged when highways sliced through them, and many areas have continued to be negatively impacted by their locations adjacent to major interstates. Many neighborhoods near the highway network have a large proportion of low-income residents. You can see in red the lower income residential areas. And highways have served to separate communities with varying economic status and amenities. For example, the low-income Roseland neighborhood, which is down on this, encircled by highways, has difficulty connecting to adjacent areas that have more employment and opportunities because of the highway barrier. The irony of the scale of highways in the city of Chicago is the number of residents who live adjacent to them who do not use them. Many households have no vehicles, and the roadways do not improve their ability to get around the region. So as we began this effort, we wanted to hear about specific issues and determine solutions to current day problems that are presented by this transportation infrastructure. So MPC developed a web-based tool to collect information on where people were experiencing barriers and what their ideas were for solutions. We emailed out information on a community-based tool, a web-based tool, where people could input information. We conducted a virtual open house. We attended in-person events to gather information directly from the communities. And here you can see some of the project types that were used as examples in the tool, such as complete streets, underpass parks, and highway caps. I'd like to thank MPC member Chris Tiongson for his great work doing GIS analysis for many of the maps, and leading development of the engagement tool, and Debbie Liu helped with the engagement effort. Once the federal notice of funding opportunity for the Reconnecting Communities grant was released, MPC developed scoring criteria to prioritize projects that would be most competitive in these grant applications. We used many of the federal tools recommended by US DOT. MPC's Hugo Coronado led the way in scoring these projects. Here you can see the project types that were received. Of 120 community-generated ideas, 76 projects passed the pre-screening for suitability to apply for a Reconnecting Communities grant. Transit projects included those to open or reopen stations or improve stations. Bicycle and pedestrian projects included road diets, complete streets, or access to transit. Parks included Rails to Trails project, mini highway caps that connected parks. Underpass community space included underpass plazas, placemaking. Highway redesign included design of entrance and exit ramps or adding highway caps to facilitate crossing the highways. And viaduct improvements. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of viaducts in Chicago under highways and rail lines, and many of them are not pleasant to traverse. And so there were many locations with improvements desired to viaducts. Once we had the basic project idea, we made assumptions about the extent of the projects and fleshed out solutions a bit more. For the top projects, we consulted community-based organizations to verify that these ideas were viewed as positive changes for the community and flesh them out a little bit further. We can see how many of the projects cluster around major highways, especially I-290 or the Eisenhower, which is the east-west corridor on the west side of the city, and the Skyway toll road to the south. We also found it noteworthy that more than half of the projects submitted were complete streets oriented. You can see in this map all the gold corridors where complete streets projects were submitted. This really shows a tremendous desire for projects that improve basic walkability and that we can address many problems by implementing traffic calming, pedestrian safety, and bike safety projects throughout the city and region. So after this work was done, or while it was in the final stages, this project team collaborated with the City of Chicago on submitting a grant application for the Reconnecting Communities project grant application category. We built on the engagement work done via the MPC effort, and the City of Chicago had another engagement meeting. And we'll drop a link to the application that was actually submitted into the chat. This is a success story in that the project for which the city applied was driven by community needs, surfaced through this process, and there was consensus about the application. However, unfortunately, it was not awarded in the first round. And we are still awaiting a debrief from US DOT for feedback about the application. But we know we have 4 more cycles of Reconnecting Communities to go under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, 5-year program. And we also know that we are not limited to only seeking funding via that category of grants. There are many ideas that could be relevant for other categories of funding. We're currently in conversations with multiple agencies in the region, including the Chicago Department of Transportation, the Chicago Department of Planning and Development, Cook County, and the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning about future pathways for getting projects designed and implemented, including those beyond the 22 identified for Reconnecting Communities. There are a lot of great ideas, and we're also working on securing technical support for projects that are very new. We heard of a number of project ideas that had not really been written down before, and so we're figuring out ways to advance design and project development support. So that's the end of my presentation, and I will stop sharing my screen. And now we'd like to move on to our panel discussion. I'm going to ask the panel some questions that we'll discuss, and then we will open the conversation to some questions from the public. So as you're listening to our conversation, as you're reflecting about what I've presented, please drop any questions that you have into the Q&A so that we can access them. So I'm happy to be here again with Lauren Burdett from the City of Chicago, Lauren Meyer from the Congress for the New Urbanism, who has a national perspective, and Javon Moore from the Austin neighborhood, representing Austin Coming Together. So let's start with Javon and hear a little bit about the community perspective. Tell us a little bit about Austin, and what are the types of things that you hear from residents about the barriers that infrastructure presents to them?
Sure. First, let me say thank you, Audrey, and to the entire team at MPC who worked so tirelessly to help put together this application and this report. It was very grateful to be a part of it in our organization. A little bit about the community thoughts as it relates to transportation and infrastructure. A couple of things do come to mind. One, it's the challenges of just building setbacks and the walkability of our neighborhoods. Two, the sidewalk width to be able to get around, and the safety challenges that it currently imposes in some areas. I think more specifically, hearing a resident discuss about the challenge of walking through Cicero Avenue or Cicero, or walking through or down Central Avenue. And then there's also the challenges as it relates to I-290, closed Blue Line stations that you had alluded to earlier. And so these all pose challenges that many residents have spoken up about. Even as we look at other infrastructure problems that have come up, not just with the residents, but with business owners, the alleys can pose a problem to the growth of development on Chicago Avenue or on Madison Avenue, to not allow for trucks, or they're not wide enough for trucks to be able to get behind there, so to service future businesses or current businesses. And so there are other infrastructure problems and challenges that kind of come up, particularly during our work and with our work around our quality of life plan.
Yeah, maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about how you do your work in Austin and what the quality of life plan is all about.
Yeah. So Austin Coming Together is a organization. It is a connecting and a convening organization that brings together, in theory, to work to bring together the different organizations and community partners within Austin to help strive and create a thriving Austin community. And so with that, a couple of years ago, we, along with over 200 stakeholders, gathered together to put together the thoughts and ideas for what this community could and should look like, with the help of lead agency with that, LISC, who helped us put together our first ever quality of life plan. And so with that, it allowed for us to be able to have community input on what the needs and also the potentials for the Austin community were. And so, as you could imagine, several thoughts came up with that. And as we look at, as it relates to transportation, two of the things that came up, one was centered around Central Avenue, which is a north-south corridor. And then there's also the challenges related to I-290. And part of that actually go hand in hand. Our Central Avenue work currently right now, we are working with CMEP, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and putting together a corridor plan for Central Avenue so that it can really live out what it actually is. And that's being a spine of the Austin community. It helps to connect all parts of Austin. Austin is the second largest community area by square footage in the city of Chicago, and it is the third largest by population. And so as far as connecting all 5 parts of Austin from Galewood to Galewood to the far north, all the way down to the island in the far south, Central Avenue is the only street that actually connects all 5 parts, particularly for residential use. And so one of the goals is to be able to help bring thought and idea and put on paper what it is that would help to make that corridor help to serve as a connector for Roosevelt, serve as a connector for Madison, Chicago Division, North Avenue, so on and so forth.
Thanks so much, Javon. And I'll just note that as we were as MPC was developing the report, we did consult community quality of life plans like yours and tried to make sure we were not redoing work that already had been done and incorporated some of the work that you already had. So there was alignment. Next, I'd love to hear from Lauren Burdett from the city's equity office. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you decided to get involved in this and take a leadership role in this application, and a little bit more about the process from your perspective?
Sure. And again, thanks Audrey and MPC for being here. I think this is an amazing report, and throughout hopefully the next 45 minutes, you'll see that it's really centered in the city's application. So we're really grateful for all of the work MPC and the partners and the Transportation Equity Network have done to help us get here. And before I answer sort of why we're involved, I'll say it's unusual for our office to get involved in a federal grant process. We're a subsection of the mayor's office. We're a new unit created in 2019, and we mostly focus on institutional change, building capacity within city departments. So the Chicago Department of Transportation is one of the departments that, of all of 28 of them, that we've worked with to help them build a racial equity action plan. But the decision to get involved in this grant actually came because we are consistently looking for opportunities that leverage and highlight potential solutions to our underlying problems. And one of the biggest problems that Chicago faces is the fact that our map of the city, regardless of which problem you're looking at, whether it's life expectancy, whether it's broadband connectivity, whether it's poverty, whether it's commute times, our map consistently looks the same. And how do we disrupt the reality that our Black and Hispanic residents are having these worse outcomes than our white residents? And so when we saw Secretary Buttigieg's announcement, I was super excited, and I was like, this is an opportunity for us to actually center racial equity, get federal money for it, and reorient and recenter our transportation and sort of our this idea of solving our problem of the underlying map issues. Part of why, and so one, I think it's an amazing opportunity, and we were really excited about the federal government's commitment, not just to acknowledging the role that they played in a lot of this harm that's happened, but also in providing money to solve it. Often federal and state governments are, I mean, locally they're notorious for, saying, hey, fix this problem with your own money. And so we think this is an amazing chance, and I really credit the Biden administration for centering racial equity in this grant. So our team pulled a group of city departments together, and one of the other roles that we play is kind of wrangler among many city departments. So this is not just a Chicago Department of Transportation opportunity. This is a Department of Housing opportunity. It's a planning and development opportunity. It's an environmental and climate opportunity, and it's a health opportunity. So we grabbed folks from all of those departments and said, hey, we think this is a really extraordinary chance for Chicago to kind of like center reconnecting communities as a transportation priority. Everyone was on board. It really aligns with Mayor Lightfoot's commitments to Invest Southwest and a lot of the sort of economic development priorities that we've had in a lot of these communities. So we were ready to go. It was honestly not a huge persuasion campaign internally. The part that then we started shifting was, how do you address that sort of grant? Because sometimes a typical approach to a grant can be, maybe you kind of gather the usual suspects together, you figure out, okay, where should we apply? Where's an opportunity? Where are we already spending money? And let's go from there. the fact that MPC had gathered their advisory committee and had been working closely with the Transportation Equity Network provided a much more inclusive opportunity to hear from residents directly impacted by the highway challenges in the city. So we pretty quickly actually reached out to Audrey and the team at MPC and worked together to build our own criteria to align with what residents were saying and align to the NOFO from USDOT. I'll pause there, but we can go maybe more in depth later into the grant itself.
Great, thanks so much, Lauren. Yeah, this has been a great case study of advocates working with city agencies and coordinating amongst city agencies. So now I'd love to hear from Lauren Meyer, given your national perspective at the Congress of New Urbanism. Your group has really been elevating the conversation about reimagining cities without highways. Can you tell us what you're hearing nationwide while you're doing this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So Congress for the New Urbanism has been in this space for quite a long time. We issued our first Freeways Without Futures report back in 2008, and we have seen a lot of movement in the space since then. This was a really exciting year for our Freeways Without Futures report because it was the first one to coincide with this federal recognition of the impacts and the inequitable impacts that freeway construction has had on urban areas. And so this was a really interesting opportunity to see what kind of applications we were getting this year, where there was a bigger conversation around the impacts of highway infrastructure and kind of the fact that there was now money, not just from states or from communities for this work, but from the federal government, really kind of putting their money where their mouth is, if you will. And so what we really saw across the board was a lot more interest from local governments, in addition to the on-the-ground activists who have been doing this work for a long time. We, after our 2021 report, started up the Freeway Fighters Network as a way to kind of help support these activists who are working within kind of grassroots community organizing to organize against highway expansion and then organizing for highway capping or full removal, a la the highways to boulevards ethos. And so it was very interesting having these groups all come together to kind of share their knowledge, their know-how, the different kind of research that they're doing, much like you're doing with this wonderful report here, illustrating really how you can see across the board the inequitable health impacts, environmental impacts, and economic impacts that come as a result of building these highways where we have. And so bringing together, we have, I think, around 81 campaigns currently featured on the Freeway Fighters Network map. And they are all at various stages of kind of the advocacy work, from your long entrenched campaigns that have been doing this advocacy work for years to the new campaigns that are just getting started. And it was really interesting to see this money come out when it did, because it really helped kind of lift up some of those smaller campaigns and really make it clear that with the hard work that a lot of different organizations are doing and having the support of both state, local, or national organizations such as us, that you can actually start these conversations, start these studies, and hopefully then see some impacts in the future. So this has been just a really exciting year to see the Reconnecting Communities financing come about for the first round. And we're really excited to kind of see what happens with the next 4 rounds of funding, just in terms of what other organizations, grassroots efforts, and just which freeways start to get more attention when it comes to the impacts that they have on their communities.
Thanks so much for that national perspective. I know we've dropped several links into the chat, so you can see the map that Lauren referred to that shows the different campaigns all over the country. So it's really this lens that we're now looking at through Reconnecting Communities. That lens got opened up a few years ago already, through this effort, and there are folks doing weekly calls trying to communicate about, or monthly calls, I guess, to communicate about their campaigns. So let's talk a little bit, maybe get a little bit even more specific about this application here in Chicago, and what reconnecting communities means in Chicago. So we wound up that the application that was developed was along the Eisenhower, and as I had noted earlier, there were many different projects that were suggested along the Eisenhower, and the application that the city did wound up sort of synthesizing, I think, some of those suggestions. Javon, can you tell us a little bit more about the importance of the proposal to address some of the issues along the Eisenhower to your community?
Yeah, so as I made mention, the Eisenhower literally split up and runs right through a portion of our southern area for the Austin community. So much so that it created its own micro community that is ironically called the Island, where it sits almost as an island of itself and is bordered to the south by Cicero and to the west by Oak Park. And so it creates almost like this island that is separate, not only from the community, but even it may feel as if for some residents separate from what happens with the rest of the city. And so in addition with the Eisenhower serving as this cut through the community, there's also the challenge as related to some closed Blue Line stations that are along the Eisenhower Expressway, particularly as you look in the community of Austin. There's a closed Blue Line station at Central Avenue that was once open at one point in time, but if outside of that station being closed, and another station that's also closed, the access points in Austin along the Blue Line are either Cicero or Austin. And so the far distance between the two makes it a challenge to be able to get to access the Blue Line for residents. It makes it a challenge for residents to access the Blue Line. In addition to that, the park, while as beautiful as it is, Columbus Park, and as much of an attraction as it is, can also pose a challenge to the utilization of the Blue Line as well. And so by opening up a station at Central Avenue would help for better access point, particularly for those that are in the middle part of the Austin community, at least on that southern end. Additionally, opening up the or some of the challenges or needs, as I made mention of before, that's related to the Blue Line and how not just the Blue Line, but the Eisenhower Expressway, there's a challenge of how traffic flows on and off of the expressway at some of our exits, and creates safety challenges for persons that are trying to access to get from the northern end to the southern end or vice versa. And so the safety challenges for pedestrians, the safety challenges for those with mobility challenges pose problems as well, particularly as persons may be flying off the Eisenhower Expressway, particularly because it's probably, I think, the only one in the city that has those left-hand exits at Harlem, actually Austin and at Harlem. And so that poses a problem as that traffic backs up for persons or for drivers. Many of them try to avoid that and will go off onto the exits and take the arterial streets. And thus the speeding and other problems create a major problem for pedestrians, for children, for those that are utilizing non-motorized transportation.
Thank you, Javon. And I think that's the problem in many, many places that we are seeing, like the entrance and exit ramps to highways and how the conflicts for pedestrians and cyclists, that has been a problem for a very long time and is hard to solve. Also, just really wanted to hear from you, based on this experience and other experiences you've had, what is your view of the role of community-based organizations in pursuing grant applications like these?
Yeah, so CBOs particularly ought to, and in many instances actually do, have a finger on the pulse of what's happening in community. And it's important to be able to get community input, get community expressions and thoughts as it relates to anything that's going inside of a particular community. One of the challenges historically, particularly for African American community and for Latino community, and particularly as we look at the community of Austin, is that things have happened to them and not necessarily with the community. And so by involving community-based organizations that are actually on the ground doing the work to connect with community, to bring community together, it helps to be able, in my opinion, to help to be able to create a stronger argument. In addition, it also creates better equity so that way things aren't necessarily just happening to these communities, to these residents, to these local businesses that they are not necessarily aware of or didn't have necessary community input to be able to help guide how it can potentially look. And so that's why for Austin, our quality of life plan is very important. That's why as it relates to our work with CMAP currently and creating a corridor plan for Central Avenue, that's important. That's why it was important for us to be able to come and sit at this table to speak up on behalf of not just our residents, but several West Side residents. And as I may mention, our Blue Line station is closed, but there's a station closed at California. There are stations closed further down on the Blue Line that were really closed primarily, for lack of a better term, because of racism, to limit who can access that particular mode of transportation and who cannot. And so it was a way and a means to be able to limit that, not only that access to downtown, but also that access throughout the rest of the city.
Thanks, Javon. And I'll just add, with respect to this whole quarter that you're talking about, there's an expectation that our state DOT is going to be reconstructing this whole corridor, the highways at the end of its useful life. And so that was another reason why we all pursued this application, to try to get ready for that big project and make sure it becomes a project that serves people better and that can be transformative and resolve some of these problems. I'd love to hear now from Lauren Burdett about other projects the city is pursuing, maybe not huge federal grants or maybe to restore connectivity between communities.
Yeah, and I want to elevate something Javon said around, the role of racism in these decisions that have been made historically. I mean, one of the things that we do in the equity office when we look at when we approach this grant, when we approach anything, is looking at who's benefiting from a policy and who's being most burdened. And when you look at particularly 290, right? And for those of you who are not from Chicago, this is our highway that stretches west all the way to the western suburbs, which are majority white. And the people who live in those suburbs really benefit from a high-speed highway that goes through a community, right? Like they can quickly get to downtown where their jobs are. The people who are living around the highway, as Javon said, that were split apart, right? The community itself was physically split. The people who take public transit, the people who want to bike, the people who live in communities and are harmed by the air pollution are the ones most burdened. So the idea of having racial equity centered in policy is centering it on those communities, right, who are most burdened, and then not just doing something for them, but partnering with communities in that area to design what the solutions could look like. So we're really, even though we didn't get the grant, which is a bummer, we're really proud of the process that we went through for this application, and we're hoping that model of partnership and of centering the most impacted is something that's true, not just for federal grants, but for state grants. We would love to partner with IDOT and county and other folks across the region to make that a default practice instead of an unusual kind of one-off example. Some of the other sort of structures that we're doing regarding reconnecting communities involves our equitable transit-oriented development efforts, which have received a lot of power with the recent ordinance, the Connected Communities Ordinance, which is something we're all really excited about, which focuses on how do we think about, the transit connectivity to the rest of the city and making sure that, there's folks around the entire Chicago area that are centering this priority in their development work. There's a couple of projects on actually the Blue Line that just got funded as part of the pilot project, pilot $10 million funding from the city. And so we think those are also really great examples that both promote connectivity and promote economic development in the region. Another dimension of connectivity, besides the Chicago Department of Transportation cycling strategy and the strategic plan, which I think many people on this call are probably familiar with, is actually our virtual and digital equity plan. So the city, it's no joke or surprise to anyone that, you know, there's a lot more happening virtually now, from telemedicine and working remote to even like applying for a job at the city, right? Like you need an internet connection. And so the city has a digital equity plan. And so we're thinking about connectivity, certainly from a physical perspective, but also from the virtual perspective, and working with the federal and state governments to try and find ways to make sure that our communities are least connected in all the ways now become more connected, both virtually and physically. I can't, let me see if I can find the fact here. I think it's that so while internet access generally in Chicago is strong, our Black neighborhoods are the least connected. And in some of our neighborhoods, particularly on the Southwest side, it's 1 in 3 residents are not connected to a home-based internet connection. So I think in an ideal world, we have all these disparate plans that talk about reconnection. I think it would be a really great opportunity to actually go through all of them, look at the community quality of life plans, and kind of create an overall, like, what is the reconnection plan for the city in both of these dimensions.
Thanks, Lauren. That's really helpful. And then Lauren Meyer, we'd be interested to hear how the Reconnecting Communities grant, which is sort of elevating these issues by the federal government for the first time, how is that intersecting with the movement that you had already kind of started at CNU? How is people's awareness growing as a result of this?
Yeah, so I would definitely say that the awareness of the inequitable impacts of highway construction and where they're chosen to be sited is definitely becoming a bit more mainstream. We definitely saw an uptick, especially when we released this report. We had a lot of people being like, well, why isn't this highway in here? Why isn't this highway? And it's not because this is an exclusive list. It is because our tent is so big and there are so many different actions that can be taken, that having this federal funding is just really making people more aware of the types of opportunities that they can have, and the idea that the only solution is adding more lanes. We are seeing time and time again now, and people are really seeing firsthand how adding or expanding highways isn't solving the problems that highway expansion claims to solve. And so as people are actually seeing those things happen in their own communities, in their own neighborhoods, they are more able to articulate that maybe we do need a different way forward. Maybe we don't need another lane. What if that becomes a bike lane, a bus lane, a sidewalk, all the kinds of things that you actually need to make a complete street grid that then creates the kinds of places people actually want to live, they want to walk, they want to work. And then it can also in turn bring in kind of the economic development and the kinds of health benefits that we see from places that are less burdened by air pollution. So overall, the national kind of momentum has been very exciting for this movement as a whole. There have been people who have been advocating for this for many years. Some of them were able to get Reconnecting Communities financing, and some of them were not. And I do hope that we do hear a little bit more feedback from USDOT about the way they accepted or rejected some of those applications. And then one other thing that I do want to mention is that now that there is this federal financing, now that this is becoming a broader movement, a more recognized way forward for people to actually create the communities they want, that we do still need to remember that the last thing we ever want to do is displace anyone that currently lives in these neighborhoods. When we see things happen, like, for example, in Rochester, New York, they were able to bury about 2.5 miles of inner loop freeway, and that buried highway has now become about $299 million worth of development for the city. And so it's again very important that the people right now on the ground doing the advocacy work, making those connections with the community, helping them vision what they want for the future, that those people are able to remain in their communities once projects like this actually do get off the ground and are funded, years in the future or whatever it may be, making sure that these projects are rooted in community priorities and have anti-displacement measures in place for legacy residents. So it's really exciting to see these conversations kind of being able to take the next step, because this is now going to become proof of concept for a lot of people. There have been over 18 very successful highway removals within the United States. And some of them you might not even notice because the area around them is so nice now that you would never think that a highway used to be there. And so it's really important, I think, that we see kind of this next step and this next level of highway removal with this federal government support. And then just making sure that, equity and anti-displacement measures are still kind of at the forefront when it comes to reconnecting these communities.
Thank you. And I think, we're at the beginning of this movement from the standpoint of it being introduced via the bipartisan infrastructure bill. What do folks, and this could be anyone on the panel, think are, what can we expect over the course of the bipartisan infrastructure bill? How do you think this is going to evolve over the next 5 years? And what do you think, everyone, community members, cities, officials should be doing to be helping think about these issues differently?
I can say what I hope. I don't know if I have any insight into what the federal agencies are going to do. But one of the pieces that we built into Chicago's grant application was providing stipends for community members to be part of the process and the design along the way if we won the grant. There was a lot of concern around whether that was an allowable use from USDOT, because in the past, federal agencies have been pretty strict about what you can and can't use funds for, especially in planning grants. And so, this is an example of where I think there could be really great alignment between external advocates who, push city, state, and federal governments to make sure that their guidance is clear so that stipends for residents most impacted in the design and planning process are consistently, clearly an allowable use of funds. So I think that's one piece that hopefully we could see over the next 5 years be clarified and expanded. And then ideally, outside of just the Reconnecting Communities grant, starting to think about all of our transportation infrastructure funds in that sort of vein.
Thanks, Lauren. So I think at this point, we can turn to a few of the questions that have come in through the Q&A. And just a reminder to everyone who's on the call or on the Zoom, if you have a question you'd like to ask, go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we'll see if we can get to it. One thing that's a relatively easy to answer is there was a specific question about some hazards in Palos Park. So this is not only an issue in the city, it's an issue everywhere. There can be large highways and large arterial roads, and a person is asking about issues along State Highway 7, Route 7. And I wanted to just share with everybody, this is good timing to ask this question, that there is an ongoing project by the Illinois Department of Transportation. We're going to drop a link into the chat that they're actually, the Illinois Department of Transportation right now is collecting, they're doing an active transportation plan, and they are collecting data right now on where there are dangerous locations for biking and walking. And so we just put a link into the chat. So please, all of you, go in there and document places in your community where it's unsafe. And hopefully this can contribute to future investments, and please share widely. So that's, that's one thing. We're also hearing a question. There's a question about how to do engagement better in terms of engaging traditionally underrepresented groups. Do we have any advice for specific outreach strategies? So I'm sure all of you have advice. I think Lauren mentioned one thing about compensating community-based organizations to ensure that they can devote the time and resources to participate. But I'd love to hear particularly from Siobhan. How would your community like to be engaged? Can you share a little bit about what advice you would give to this person who's asking this question?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that come to mind as it relates to engaging with community on transportation, or just really anything that particularly government or an outside entity that's coming into community will be seeking to do. One is actually on the ground engagement. It's one thing that's okay for the expectation to send out, we'll send out an email to all of these different partners or whatever. But unfortunately, sometimes that does not necessarily reach the actual residents that will be impacted within communities, particularly as it relates to transportation. Another thing would be actually hosting meetings at an appropriate hour for people that work. Unfortunately, a lot of the calls that I've participated in over the past couple of years as it relates to even transportation or relates to development from a governmental perspective or other nonprofits, many a times these meetings and gatherings, whether virtual or in person or hybrid, too often occur during the day without an option for those that may work during the day. And so it'd be important to make sure that there are opportunities for persons to engage in the process that exists outside of your traditional 9 to 5 hours. And I know that means a lot for those of us that may work on the other side and that we have to stay later or what have you. But it is important, if we're going to really be serious about engaging with residents, we have to take that engagement very seriously and to make it easy and approachable for them. So that's definitely that. And it just reminds me of, I was reading something the other week or earlier this week, and it was talking about it. There's a lack of persons actually participating in something. You need to go back and see, is it actually easy for them to participate, or are you creating a barrier for them to participate? And so I think that's really important if we're going to look at that. And then the other thing I have to say is actually listen to community residents. Another thing I've seen happen as it relates to just, things related governmentally or some of the challenges is that residents aren't necessarily being listened to. Again, it kind of goes back to things being put in communities or brought to communities or happening to communities without the involvement of the community. So it's important for government, for organizations to ensure that they actually listen to the residents and which they're trying to get input and feedback on, and actually put that in there and have it be along the entire process and not just towards the final phase when you have something already created and say, this is what we're going to do in your community. Unfortunately, that just doesn't work and doesn't work well.
Thanks, Javon. I'm also seeing a question here about highway caps. And I just wanted to highlight, that a few of the projects are recommended by community members in Chicago were related to highway caps. And also we're going to drop a link into the chat about some work that was done a few years ago by CTA about potential highway caps. There's one study in here, but there's actually another one that we'll grab that has pedestrian mini highway caps over the Eisenhower that were sketched as potential future treatments that could be incorporated with the reconstruction of the highway. And so I wanted to hear from Lauren Meyer, CNU's perspective on highway caps, and also how do you make sure that those don't result in making a highway widening at the same time?
Yeah, so we definitely have supported highway caps as a potential solution for some communities. It really does depend on a lot of different factors. We have featured highway caps in our Freeways Without Futures report in the past. This year, it includes one of the visions from Austin I-35, which also did get Reconnecting Communities funding to study highway caps. Unfortunately, that one is part of an expansion and not really what we're hoping for with highway caps. Another example would be the LID I-5 campaign in Seattle. Seattle has already capped parts of Interstate 5, and they're looking to cap more. Highway caps can have a lot of good, especially when you're looking to complete a street network or a street grid. That is one of the best ways to kind of help build the connections that have been severed by a big highway. We definitely see a lot of freeway caps when it comes to different local governments or state governments trying to find the solution without having to ever sacrifice moving cars as quickly as possible. So when you see things like a little strip of highway that's covered and then the rest of it is speeding by the same old right next to houses, that is not really going to be a successful highway cap. The most successful ones really do try and reknit the street grid over a good acreage of space to really make those effective. We've definitely seen highway caps proposed, sometimes by local campaigns, as a way to get government buy-in, really being like, if you just already have a trenched freeway, so something that's already inset into the ground, and then adding a cap might be far more cost effective than doing a full kind of removal. It is one way for certain campaigns to really start actually reconnecting their communities while still kind of not having to fully woo the government entities or whatever they need to, and also try to convince them to get rid of vehicle lanes. So capping can really be a way to literally bridge the gap when it comes to finding solutions to really burdensome infrastructure. So we do support caps as far as a solution. We would love to see more boulevards and reduction in lanes, but we know that can't be possible everywhere. And so really anything that can help restitch a community, help reduce noise, pollution, all those kinds of things, we think is always a great option.
Thanks, Lauren. I also want to acknowledge a question about the potential for transit-oriented development to apply to all metro stations. It's a great point, especially given transportation patterns are never going to be the same as they were with everyone wanting to go downtown and the work from home. That is something certainly MPC is interested in, and I think we all need to be interested in how we can repurpose some of those parking lots that are not going to get the demand that they had before. I know the RTA also does TOD studies and supports municipalities in the suburbs with transit-oriented development studies. So that just wanted to flag that that's a great point. And I think lastly, do you want to just see if Javon or anyone has any advice for managing gentrification that can happen if we're making places better? There's always a concern that the people who currently live there will face rising costs, rents, and struggle to stay in the community. Did you incorporate any of that into the quality of life plan, or do you have any thoughts as we contemplate improving the Eisenhower corridor?
Yeah, so one of the things to kind of help with that is community, as well as our elected officials working together to ensure that the work that's done or the improvements that are made one, actually do work to benefit those that are currently there or legacy resident. But two, to ensure that while these improvements may happen, to limit its impact as it relates to property taxes, to help limit its, particularly for residents, to limit its impact to other additions or challenges that may come up that may end up pushing legacy residents. And then the other thing is actually listening to community residents, as I may mention earlier. And these engagement meetings or events, it's important to actually take time to listen to the residents. Unfortunately, gentrification, it happens, but it is important for government to get in front of it to help prevent communities being taken advantage of by whether it's developers or even government itself.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer. Well, I'm looking at the clock and we're right at the top of the hour, so that flew by. I just want to thank our panelists so much. Lauren Burdett with the City of Chicago Equity Office, Javon Moore with Austin Coming Together, and Lauren Meyer for Congress for New Urbanism. You shared so much incredible knowledge with everyone today. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to all the people that have joined us today. Thank you so much for joining this conversation, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.